right. Well, I'm here today with Patrick Bagan, founder and president of Wagan Holdings. I'm Brandon Guderian, head of finance, and we're just getting together to talk a little bit, mainly to pick your brain, Patrick, about how do we look at underwriting deals, right? We're in the business of multifamily real estate investment, but how do we look at deals? How do we select which ones to pursue? There's just so much noise out there in the market from people, especially all forms of investors, entry level, midpoint, very seasoned investors. There's just a lot of stuff out there. So I think our goal today is just to talk a little bit about how do we select, how we deliberate about the properties that we pursue. And then as well as what's the process look like along the way. This is part one of a 5-part series in that, just to kind of help educate. But we're going to get into your brain a little bit, okay?
Yep.
In a non-invasive, fun way,
Yeah,
Patrick. But
good.
this is what we do for fun on the weekdays and the weekends. Anyway,
it's our job.
This is
Quite
our job.
literally our
And we
job,
like talking
so.
to each other too. So this is fun. So let's just start a little bit about how we look at properties, multifamily properties that we want to pursue.
Yeah,
so,
essentially what's our buy box?
Exactly. And then we go through a strategic planning exercise every year where we go and say, like, what's our mission, vision, values? Who do we serve? What's kind of, where do we play? Where do we not play? And that's continually evolving, but it's important when we try to get precise about where do we want to buy. Can you talk a little bit about what are the types of properties that we look at in terms of vintage? You can talk about unit count if you want. I know you have a perspective on that.
Yeah.
Dollar amount, location. Can you just kind of get into that and we can kind of go from there?
Yeah, sure. So I guess like we kind of nailed down what's going to be our core market and what do we kind of like about that market. And so like for us right now, when we're first getting started, we're looking for something that's going to be kind of close to home. For most of us, it's like for most of our group, I should say, not most of us, but most of our group, we kind of live in the Twin Cities area.
Minnesota.
And that's like a market that we believed in and we understand, know the growth trajectory, found partners here that are reliable.
Relationships,
property
right?
management, exactly. Brokers, like everything like that. It's easy for us to kind of get a grasp on it, especially as we started out and started to grow in the market.
Yep.
And so that was kind of the first thing. The second thing then is like, okay, if you're getting started on something, it's a balance of like, do you really know enough about the years of the buildings and like the construction from the original building to be able to say confidently like, oh yeah, I want to invest in this specific type of building from this year's because of X, Y, and Z.
It's like understanding the asset in which you're acquiring and being able to drive value within that asset, right?
Right.
Like, because you started out with 8 units in the Twin Cities metro, and I'm sure then you
1960s vintage.
And we're kind of like, just like anything in life, we're always learning. And so, you know, you acquire an asset, you learn more about that asset, and you continually kind of distill and refine what you're looking for. So, from a vintage perspective, where are we at today? Like, if you could mock up the perfect deal, Patrick, the one that would come across your desk on a Monday morning with a hot cup of coffee, what's that deal look like and why in terms of the age of the building, the size, the ilk?
Yeah, so really we'll be looking for something like 1980s or later. Okay. And I say that because the buildings that are before the 80s right now, the maintenance that goes into keeping those buildings up or bringing them back to life really is substantial and significant. We've learned that firsthand from the buildings that we've purchased, right? It is a heavy capital add in the first few years of buying those buildings. And it does dig into like, what can you pay your investors on a distribution basis?
Yeah, that variability within maintenance and repairs budget is, you don't, kind of like an old car, but on steroids and sorts, where, you know, you can see probably historical data on a property, P&Ls, financial statements, but until you get in the door, you don't always really know what the deferred maintenance is and what it's going to impact to the cost profile.
Yeah, and the building materials that were used in like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, like we learned a lot of stuff before 1970, 1980 range.
That's a good point too.
From like a construction standpoint, pipes that leach lead into your drinking
safety,
water.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Understanding how safe your buildings are, right?
And like, do you have any what's the word for it? Like remediation that you have to do for like asbestos or whatever, right? Like things that kill you.
Yeah, exactly. That's not a risk we're willing to take.
Yeah, right. And so like understanding that like those materials have a impact on your budget and like what you can do. Like we've found that 1980s and later kind of helps us satisfy that like really happy medium of like, okay, if an owner wasn't as up to date on maintenance and stuff like that, we can kind of bring it back.
Yep.
But it won't cost us so much that we will be paying for it for a really long time.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it doesn't impact essentially the strategic plan or our pro forma, like our targets that we commit to, right, to our investors. So that's appreciate that. So kind of 1980s vintage or newer. How do you look at the value of a deal and also the units associated and where you find your sweet spot?
Yeah. So for the longest time, I feel like we were always like, oh, we're going to do X number of units.
Yeah.
And like
100 units a year, every year for 10 years. Or
right.
Something like that. Yeah.
And like at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily mean as much because really when you're looking at like how you're paying people out and like what your returns and everything's based on revenue.
Yeah.
And so when we're starting to transform our mindset around like how many units are we going to buy and rather like what asset value under management are we trying to get to
yield the best form of scale in our delivery.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep.
Because like most of our partners operate on and when I say most of our partners, I'm specifically talking about lenders, property managers, the people that kind of impact your balance sheet.
Well, even contractors too. If you can have a certain type of size and scale for folks coming in to say turn a unit,
exactly,
you're going to get a reduced unit cost compared to if they're just coming in to do one or two.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into the unit count strategy. Sure. Maybe not as much as the asset
that's a good
value.
Point. I digress.
But really like that revenue lever, right? Yeah. Like how much revenue are you going to bring in? Because that kind of informs like the pricing that you're going to get from those partners.
Sure. Yep.
So like lenders, right? Larger deals, there is a little bit more preferred pricing. Interest rate might not be as high. Like they're going to feel a little bit more comfortable lending you some money because of the fact that you have like a lot of offsetting revenue streams to pay them back.
Yep.
Right? Things they care about. Property manager, they care about what their revenue target is for the year. They don't necessarily care about how many units they have to manage.
Or what percentage they're actually charging at the end of the day. It's how many dollars is the check worth, which is tied to the revenue usually, a percentage of revenue.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
And so being cognizant of like more so rather like what's our asset value goal and like how do we get there from a revenue standpoint rather than saying like, oh, we're going to do 100 doors this year. That's so dependent on a different market. Like if you truly just want to grab a bunch of doors, like because you care so much more about doors, like then you might as well go to like a mid-tier Iowa market, right?
Sure.
Where you could pick up
more
a
doors
building for
less
like
cost.
$60K a door or something, right?
Yep.
But then the revenue you're bringing in is going to match that, right? And so like it's where do you feel like you're going to be able to provide back to your investors like what they're kind of expecting and ours kind of is based on that revenue lever as well as the assets under management.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's say that sweetheart deal comes across your desk. It's got the vintage, it's got the price point that yields a certain amount of revenue per year that unlocks the scale you're looking for in the deal, that you can hit your investor returns, you can do right by the building, you can do right by the residents that live there. You're excited, right? You're chomping at the bit. How does it go then? How do you maybe it's posted, maybe it's not. Maybe talk a little bit about that. How do you then go about engaging the process to acquire?
Basically,
or to learn
how am I finding the deal?
How are you finding the deal? And then also tell me about like if there's a broker involved, how does that go?
Yeah, sure. So we did try like the cold calling, the cold outreach.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that we had like the most sound strategy. We're just throwing darts.
You saw an apartment you liked and you tried to call the owner.
Exactly.
Okay.
And like, again, I don't necessarily think that's the best strategy. We have like friends of ours now that I know that they're having a success rate with their marketing strategy, something that we could definitely employ here. It's just not something we've spent the dollars on. They're much more willing to spend the dollars there. Sure. We've just had really good luck with the broker chains here locally. And so what I mean by that is like going to the larger brokers that specialize in multifamily housing, especially larger multifamily.
Yeah, the size that you're looking for, that you've defined as your sweet spot.
Right. Like if you're a seller, you know that like you're going to get the best price when you push it with a broker because that broker already has the large network of buyers and the large network of sellers and everyone that they've been building up those relationships with over however many decades. Yeah. Really. And so like being able to leverage their networks is really what kind of makes it more impactful. And so,
because their view of the world and their aperture, right, is very vast, right? So if you can tap into that, I guess my question to you is, if I just start in real estate, it's not like the next day I can just be in that group. Like, how much does experience play, Patrick, and how you've been able to build such meaningful relationships
yeah.
in
So
that space?
building up your balance sheet is definitely a
Okay.
helpful lever, right? And knowing where you're going to play and where you're not going to play, like size wise,
Sure.
right? So if you know, like, oh, I really can only buy like $1 million asset, then you should be able to, then you need to recognize that, like, okay, I'm not going to be reaching out to a broker and say, I'm going to do a $5 million
Yeah.
asset because like your buy box is within that
It's
$1 million
respecting
space.
people's time and then knowing where, not the shiny object
Right.
syndrome of,
And I openly recognize to the broker when I'm talking with them, like, like this is our situation. This is why we're pursuing this building.
yep,
And like,
transparency, right?
exactly.
Always.
Like they're more appreciative of that and showing that, like, my intent is to not waste your time. My intent is to be as cognizant of your time as possible, and knowing that, like, you're respecting their time, they'll respect what you have to
Yep.
say and like kind of give you a bit of the time of the day. You also might be looking at some of their assets for sale that have been passed along by other people, because they do have like kind of like first tier, second tier,
Yeah,
third
and maybe
tier,
you don't
like,
always know where you fit on the tiers
yeah.
naturally, but you could have had a bunch of people looking at it, or you could be in the top. I guess a question I would have then, when you're dealing with and interacting with brokers,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer it's good to have a strategy
Yep.
that's honed over time, built upon experience, pros and cons, upside, downside. So with that in mind, do you think what's like we've talked about the pros of having a deliberate approach, what works best for you, unlock
Yep.
scale, talk about that triple aim of doing right by your investors, doing right by a building and the residents all
Mm-hmm.
together. Is there a downside to having a very specific criteria? Is there days, weeks, months where you just don't know deals? Like, I'm just trying to get a feel for what's the other side of the coin, or
Yeah, I mean, I guess the
if at
other side of
all.
the coin is you don't have any
Sure.
deals,
Yeah.
right? And so like then, that's where like you do have to be creative in your strategies. And like our creativity has come in the form of looking in markets where we feel comfortable, that we don't feel like we're diverging too much from
Sure.
our buy box, right? And so like looking in markets like large cities in Iowa, right, that we
Or
believe could be Twin Cities style markets. And
or mid markets in Minnesota. I think Austin,
exactly.
Minnesota was a
Yeah,
prime
yeah.
example of through relationships. It's not where we were targeting at the time, but an opportunity came up and we got creative in that space.
Yeah, for sure. And like again, that was another relationship
Yeah.
type thing, right? Where I had just built up a relationship with a property manager in the Rochester market
Yeah.
and had been trying to partner on things with him for 5 years.
Years.
And
Yeah.
finally he had just sent us something and I said, "Yep, we want that one."
Yep.
And the next day we had it under contract, just because I had trust in him that he was showing me the numbers the right way.
Yep.
And like we had trust in each other that like we were the right partner to close on the building.
Well, and it's like
So,
you were investing in a relationship sincerely, right?
mm-hmm.
Because you enjoyed the person, you saw talent in the person, and just talk about just high vibrating human beings. It was worth it for the relationship. But when
Yep.
you build meaningful relationships, it makes sometimes the deal making process just that much smoother because there's just less variables, I would imagine, too.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's probably more enjoyable too because it's real human interactions along the way.
Yeah.
Not just transactions.
No, for sure. Like
It's
like when I am answering the phone and I know it's a broker calling, or if I'm calling a
yeah.
broker,
I've heard you talk to
I
brokers.
say,
Yeah.
"Hey buddy, how's it going?"
You
Right? Like,
answer the phone the same way as you talk to me or our other business partners,
right.
which I think
And
is really
I am
important.
genuine about those because I
Yeah.
have built up relationships with these
Yeah.
individuals. And the other thing too is when you close deals with them, they're a lot more into that relationship with you too.
Oh,
Like
sure.
they're
Yeah.
they know
Camaraderie.
that you invest in them and they're going to invest back in you.
Oh yeah,
So,
exactly. No, I appreciate that response big time. I think so. I can wrap it up this part one of our kind of how we underwrite and find deals. But the last question is just maybe a bit of opining on the current market. Like, what type of inventory are we seeing now, especially as it relates to how we've defined criteria, the sweet
yeah.
spot for Wagan Holdings and multifamily
Yeah. It's definitely starting to pick up right now.
compared to the
If
last?
you asked me a
Okay,
week ago, I think my answer would be different than it is today.
sure.
Right? Like,
Well, yeah,
um a lot more, and we are trending in like towards the spring summer market. And so like deals transact, I feel like, a little more frequently there. It's a lot easier for a broker and a seller to showcase a property
more
when
curb
there's no
appeal.
snow on the ground
Yeah,
and there's
yeah,
green trees in the
yeah.
yard.
Green grass is better than brown grass most of the
Yeah,
time.
right.
So, yeah.
But to that point too, right? If the grass hadn't grown back,
Then
there's that risk too.
That's true. You never know.
But yeah, as far as like supply goes in the market, we're definitely seeing an increase. So we are looking at probably like last week, I'd say we were only looking at 2 or 3 deals. I think I got 5 sent to me yesterday.
And it seems like, at least speaking from my perspective, there's been offers being written almost every week. It's a volume play, right? At the end of the day, right?
And yeah, right now we're kind of throwing darts. So it's hoping that one hits the bullseye.
Yep.
So
With our business case, aligns with the seller. And I think back to, relationships, I feel like, and keep me honest here, if a broker or an agent or a seller knows that a buyer is going to close or has confidence in that, you move up the chain a lot quicker too,
that is
right? So it's
definitely no doubt.
Like doing what you say you're going to do even when it's hard. I feel like that's the type of relationship building too that's very powerful in a lot of businesses, but this business in particular.
Yeah,
right?
it's really easy to sour a broker relationship when you don't close on it, deal, or you renege on something.
And again, if you can just be precise about what you do and align a team that can deliver, right, by building meaningful relationships, I feel like the rest of it kind of falls into place. So,
definitely.
Okay, I could talk forever about this, Patrick. You know that.
Yeah,
Maybe
I think
we'll
we
talk.
got 4 more parts. To
I think
series,
so. This is part 1 of, as you mentioned, part 1 of a 5-part series, like how we look at deals. So stay tuned, folks that are listening, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Take care.
See you soon.